live. Welcome back, everyone. I'm here, Russ Wakeland here with my friends Bill and Matt. Guys, I don't know if you've been paying attention to the news and watching what's been happening recently. Have you heard there was an election this month? Did you hear about that?
Of what?
Well, it's funny. There's actually a lot of things on the ballot. Matt, are you aware of that? They were voting on a lot of things this past month.
I've heard some news. Is this where we're going to get into the presidential election right now? I was not prepared for that.
No, I that's the funny thing is, like, that's the most uncertain thing that happened in the voting. Actually, a bunch of other stuff was on the ballot. And what's really interesting is I always find it fascinating what little questions states and political action groups and other folks try to get on the ballot during a presidential election, and there's kind of different schools of thoughts about that, right? Sometimes it's like, well, you're going to have great turnout at the presidential election, so you should try to get really important things on the ballot. And there's other schools of thought that's like, well, is anybody really going to notice that part because they're so focused on the presidential part? Did you guys really pay close attention to what was on the ballots in your home state of Massachusetts?
Bill, did you pay attention?
Of course I did. There were two. There was one for rank order balloting or rank order voting, and the other one was the I forget what it's called, but it's the thing about letting your car's computer system talk to independent mechanics. The second one was, highly controversial. Not controversial, but contested. The two sides are very strong and lots of advertising. The first one went kind of sort of under the radar and did not pass.
Now in California, Russ, there was a pretty big one on there, right?
There was. So what's interesting is, so we've talked about on this podcast before, AB 5, the law that went into effect a little over a year ago in California around, part-time workers and, freelance workers and subcontracted workers, and how they should really be, there was kind of driving more and more to make them full-time employees, make sure they had minimum wage was considered, make sure they had benefits, all those sorts of things. So AB 5 was really targeting that. But what was interesting was California put this new proposition on the ballot during the presidential election called Prop 22. Bill, were you familiar with what was in Prop 22? Did you keep an eye on that?
Did I keep an eye on it? No, but I did look into it in preparation for this podcast.
Excellent.
Spoiler alert.
Way to pull
That's what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, exactly.
Come on, Bill, play along here.
Oh, sorry. No, I didn't. Russ, why don't you tell us about Prop 22?
All right, fine. Well, actually, what's interesting about this, and first of all, I find it fascinating that it was included on this particular election cycle. Like, to your guys' point, there's a lot of interesting things happening in New Hampshire. Sometimes we include extra questions on the ballots, and sometimes we don't. This time we didn't, which I thought was interesting given the intensity of the election. But maybe the thinking is, well, with so much intensity on the top of the ticket, maybe you don't want to put any important questions at the bottom of the ticket. I don't know. But anyway, the idea behind Prop 22 is there was a lot of fevered reaction, I think. And this is now me editorializing a little bit, so I'd love your guys' thoughts on this. But there was a lot of fevered reaction to AB 5, right? Particularly from arguably some of the places it was targeting, like Uber and Lyft and people, what would now been called gig workers, right? Who are basically self-employed people who are affiliated or work for, I guess, or contract with places like Uber and Lyft and drive people around or deliver food or whatever. Under AB 5, as written intentionally, they would all have to become employees, right? And so immediately that went into the courts. Uber and Lyft requested a sort of a delay as they worked through it. And basically they were sort of in this pause state until Prop 22 came along. And the idea behind Prop 22 was to essentially exempt, I think, this is my understanding where it is now, was essentially to exempt members of the gig economy from AB 5. And I thought this was fascinating because I kind of thought that was the intent of AB 5. When you guys, so Bill, for preparation for this podcast, you started researching it. What was kind of the reaction? Am I stating it correctly? Is that what you're understanding?
Yes, and I mean, what's funny is I think there's. I had to read. You have to read between the lines because in this kind of stuff, I feel like nobody actually comes out and tells you the pure truth.
Right.
So I think that AB 5 was originally passed by the California legislature as sort of a law to rein in Uber and Lyft and, those other gig economy companies who were basically taking advantage of, at least they were perceived to be taking advantage of some perceived ambiguities. Yes, I said perceived twice. Perceived ambiguities in the law that defines what an employee is versus what a contract worker, an independent contractor is in California. And so AB 5 was passed to sort of clarify that and say, hey, Uber, hey, Lyft, DoorDash, Instacart, Postmates, all you guys, your drivers are your delivery people, people running through the supermarkets picking up groceries. Those people have to be treated as employees and therefore have to get minimum wage. They have to get benefits, and they have, all the protections of employment, which you don't get as an independent contractor. And you're right. It went to court. I don't remember which of them, whether it was Uber, Lyft, or both, went to court and to defend their position as treating them as contractors. And the court said, no, these are employees. But the courts weren't weighing in on what the definitions were. They were weighing in on what the law was. And the law was, at that point, AB 5, which has this 3-part test about what defines an employee, or actually, I think I said that backwards, is what defines an independent contractor. And the 3 parts in sort of, shorthand notation are, free from the company's control. So basically, you have discretion in what you do. You work outside of the company's usual course of business, and you're engaged in the established trade that you're doing for this, this company. And that last one is a little confusing, but it's basically like, if you're an electrician and then you go to Uber to fix wiring, you can do that as an independent contractor. You can walk in and because you're doing something that you do regularly, being an electrician, and Uber is not in the business of providing electricians. So that was what they were saying. So the court said Uber drivers are employees, not contractors, based on this test.
One thing too, sorry to interrupt, but like one thing that I think that's important with the electrician example versus like an Uber driver is that the electrician can set their own rates too and what they charge Uber to do this stuff. And the Uber drivers, correct me if I'm wrong, don't have the power to do that or didn't have the power to do that.
Right. Yeah. In fact, it's a good point. Is I believe that it's the first part, the first 2 parts of the test they failed. The third part, they didn't. So that the workers, were engaged in. It didn't matter. But anyway, so that's when, as Russ put it, the Uber and Lyft side said, let's wait and put it on the ballot, which is where things got interesting. To Russ's previous comment, I'm not sure they chose this year because it was an election. I mean, because it was, Trump versus Biden or, any other things. I think it was just, it's the next chance to get on the ballot in California. Everyone wanted this solved quickly.
True. I believe AB 5 is like September 2019. So this probably was the next chance, but also I think it's for companies like Uber and DoorDash and Lyft and all that sort of stuff. It was beneficial to them, in my opinion, that it was such a monumental election for president that they could, I don't know, somewhat sneak this in. And then the thing that they did is they poured money into it. A lot. Might have all that, a lot of money, so that advertising and Bill, you and I were talking about this too a couple of weeks ago was these companies, Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, when you're talking to consumers, you're talking to the public, these are services that people use all the time. And if you advertise towards them to sway them to vote yes on Prop 22, they're like, they have a feeling towards this. They want to be able to use Uber. They want to be able to use DoorDash, especially right now during a pandemic. And they don't want to mess with anything there. So you are able to get them to feel like Prop 22 is good for DoorDash, Uber employees, all that sort of stuff. And they're going to vote on it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and forgive me for not crediting whoever it is I'm quoting. I can't remember, but I read this somewhere, is that these apps, which are on everybody's cell phone, they put ads in the app. So when you logged into Uber or Lyft or DoorDash or whatever, you would get, in California, a notice pushing you to vote for Prop 22.
Right. Yep.
And so it's way more effective than billboards or leaflets or whatever. It's like you're bringing it right to the individual person and making them, see it and then click past it. The numbers were astonishing for those that aren't aware. It's the sort of the labor unions and the pro AB 25 or, anti Prop 22 people put up $20 million in funding for advertising against Prop 22, $20 million. Uber, DoorDash, and Lyft each put up about $50 million each, plus a couple others, to total over $200 million. So they were outspending the Prop 22 outspent, a literal math lesson, little order of magnitude, 10 times, which is impressive. It's an impressive amount of money, and as some
and when you think about
say,
when you think about all the people ordering Uber Eats and DoorDash and everything during COVID and seeing that ad every time it pops up, right? What a powerful message.
Right. So, even the drivers were seeing it.
Right. And so clearly the end of the story, or the beginning of the story, honestly, is that Prop 22 passed back on November 3rd. Right.
Yes.
And so, what did it change? I mean, did it basically, overturn AB 5? No, not really. Right. But what's, from your guys' point of view, your understanding, what's changed now? What's different right now?
So I think, Matt, you can jump in a sec. So the drivers, it really was a carve out for these businesses. They're not named, but it's basically about drivers for, food and person delivery, if you will. And so they are contractors, not employees. But it did include some of the benefits from AB 5, as well as agreeing to pay them 120% of minimum wage, which was AB 25 was obviously making them employees would mean they had to get paid minimum wage. But the controversial part there, which I hope I'm getting this right, was AB 5 was saying whenever you had your app on, if you're sitting in your car and you turn the Uber app on as a driver, you are then an employee of Uber at that point in time, whether you have somebody in the backseat or not. And Prop 22 is, we'll pay you 120% of minimum wage when you're, I forget the term they use, but it's basically actively engaged, meaning when you have somebody, a paying customer in your car. And just to avoid any confusion, the 120% isn't per se altruism on the part of the pro Prop 22 people, the Ubers and Lyfts of the world. It's recognition that in order to get somebody in your car, you have to be driving around waiting, so that they're effectively paying you paying you for 20% of your paying you for your downtime, estimating it to be about 20% of your drive time, your engaged time.
That makes sense. And that was always one of the
parts. I don't know if
there's
anything else.
Go ahead, Matt. What else? Do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think Bill was just saying something, but
no.
You know, I wasn't going to necessarily add anything onto that. Russ, if you have a question, great. But I had a question for, you guys as well, too, is now that this is passed in California, what is that? Do we know what that means for, we have a national podcast here, so we don't want to just talk about California. What does this mean for other states? And, for employees of these gig economy type, companies that in this industry, what does it mean for their employees in other states? Does this affect them? Should we expect that this is going to happen throughout the country? And if we want to park that sort of question, for a few minutes, that's fine as well.
My reaction is I think other states are watching this really closely. And Bill, I want to get your thoughts too, but I think they are looking at this. I also think when you have a large company that's in multiple states, like Uber, like Lyft, you kind of have to, you can look at it two ways. I think last time we talked about this a little bit, we referenced the CAFE standards, where automotive manufacturers, they do have to kind of manufacture their cars sort of to target whatever the emission standards are for certain states. And they try to make it work for as many states as possible. But when you have extremely strong regulations, like you do for emissions in California, you might make a vehicle specifically for California that's different for the rest of the country. I don't know. I think right now that's what these companies are trying to avoid, right? And I have sort of an anecdotal story. I think I've said this before on the podcast. My wife is a freelance automotive journalist. And when AB5 came out, it was actually very impactful for the entire freelance community, regardless of where you worked, because a lot of these publishing organizations are based in California. So even though they had freelancers across the country, suddenly they were all playing by those rules. And a lot of freelance opportunities went away as these organizations were like, we're sorry, we can no longer work with you because under AB5, we must make you an employee. And we cannot because for whatever but complicated reasons involving HR and everything else. So they simply just went away. And I'm curious about this sort of situation where they've exempted a very targeted group of organizations, which is interesting. But what about the rest of the organizations? And if other states follow suit with this, what's that going to do to the freelance community in general, right? So I don't know. I think it's, I don't know. The message it sends is kind of mixed. What do you think, Bill?
I think it's an interesting question, and Matt's right. Or Les is right. The states are. I mean, all the states are watching this because, I think I've said this before in this podcast. Is the way a lot of federal laws become laws is states start making laws. Mm-hmm. Each state makes a law on a topic, and as there starts to be some consensus view, the federal government looks at it and creates a standard to eliminate the patchwork of rules. And, for, our older listeners, you probably remember everything like cars having to comply with California emission standards, and now those are federal emission standards. Or, you have like minimum wage laws, you have, recreational marijuana laws, it's like they all sort of work their way up, state to state to state, and then, become federalized if appropriate. And then so I think states are now looking and saying, what's good and bad about what's going on in California? What should we do for our gig economy workers? And I think that Russ, you were just hitting on this, is like, I think one of the arguments for the way Prop 22 came in to counter AB5, is sort of, if at the 50,000 foot level, AB5 is a way of saying all employees must either be, sort of all workers must be either employees or independent contractors.
Right.
And the Prop 22 people are saying that was great in the 20th century. We're in the 21st century, right, in the world of gig economies and side gigs and, whatever other, millennial buzzwords you want. And they're saying, like, there's a different class of workers, and there are people that want to work a lot for doing the same thing, basically a lot for, as an Uber driver, but they want the flexibility and total control over what they do. Although, reference to Matt's comment, they don't have total flexibility. They can't set their own price, but they can set their own hours.
But they can. But what's interesting about that too, Bill, and that's a great point, and this affects actually freelance journalists too, is they can set up competition between the different providers. So if you think about Uber
Correct.
and Lyft as like, providers that connect you, the contractor, you, the driver, to your customer, right? If Lyft's willing to pay me a quarter more a ride than Uber, right, then I would prefer to pick Lyft. And so if I can have both phones on at once, right, and looking for the optimal ride, and it's sort of interesting because under the original AB5 legislation, if I had both phones on at once, I was technically an employee of both companies at the same time, which is sort of like literally minute per minute, I'm working for both companies, which is sort of an interesting rule. So you can see why the companies are like, that's not really going to work for us. Similarly, freelance writers, when they set up, they're not really like the electricians, meaning that you don't get to set your rate, right? An outlet might reach out to you and say, hey, would you be willing to write one piece for us a week at X amount of dollars per word or whatever, and you agree to that. So they've set the rate for you. A different outlet might say, we'll take 2 pieces a week from you too. Here's our rate. Great. And there's a third outlet that says the same thing. Well, if I'm writing for one of those outlets, if I am now employed by you, I can't work for the other locations. And as soon as I become an employee of yours, I have to sign this document that says all my creative work belongs to you, whether I do it on or off the clock. All of a sudden you got a giant complicated problem, right? And you kind of destroy the freelance writing industry. So you have this sort of problem where each of these industries has sort of unique challenges in it. And so I get the, it's a really interesting problem to solve. I understand the problem we're trying to solve, which is don't take advantage of workers. Make sure you're treating them fairly, but at the same time, it's pretty cool and fair that people can sell their services to multiple companies at a time, if that makes sense.
Right. Although that did raise, I didn't realize this until I was reading about Prop 22. But, one of the problems with the whole idea that you can, and we've all done this, you get into a car and your driver has Uber and Lyft on at the same time.
Right.
Is if you are treating that person as an employee, that means they're getting paid for both of those things at the same time, which, you run into all kinds of trouble. But then I was like, well, kind of if for anyone who's seen the movie or the show, The Producers, it's like, or you could just log in and sit at home.
Right.
You don't ever have to accept a ride and you're just collecting your minimum wage.
You're getting minimum wage. That's right.
Sense.
Exactly.
And that's where you've got this, the driver is an independent contractor and Uber's not, or it's not sitting there saying, okay, Russ, you're on duty today from, 8 in the morning until noon. And, we need you driving around in case we have a ride, and that, they've sort of decided, let the market decide how many drivers we need, and that they'll adjust their pricing based on the number of drivers and the number of riders.
Right.
And then, as the prices go up, more people jump into their cars. And then the prices will come down. So, I mean, overall, it's fascinating, but I do think it's like dipping a toe in the water of like how should we, the employers, or we, the government, think of people, workers, as employees or contractors, or this, sort of hybrid thing, which is, temporary on-call at-will workers. I made that up. Not the most elegant of names, but I think that's what we're going to start seeing people questioning, like what is the role of employer or company and employee or contractee, and what makes sense. And I guess we should have one of those noises when I say for another podcast, we could raise the issue of, a lot of the reason behind this Prop 22 thing was, or AB5 was, health benefits, because the drivers weren't getting health benefits.
Right.
And I sort of scratch my head every time I hear this. It's like, how did it become the employer's problem to provide health benefits for the American people?
Right.
And why do we have all these problems with Medicare for all and Obamacare and all this other stuff? And it's because, well, not everybody has a job,
right,
or has an employer who provides health care. And it's like, it's just a weird system for the government wants to regulate the benefits, but isn't providing them, although now it is providing them. But it is still this weird hodgepodge of things. And I think, this is another one of those. It's like the government's decided what it means to be a full-time or part-time employee, or full-time employee, a part-time employee, or a contractor. And maybe there are like other arrangements that make sense for the company or for the person, the individual worker.
Yeah.
And we'll see how it unfolds.
And what's really interesting too is it's very tempting, I think, and this is the reason I keep bringing up my wife's freelancing as an example. It's really interesting to think about AB5 and Prop 22 completely from the perspective of Uber and Lyft. And I'm sure that they were a big driving force because so many folks, are involved with Uber and Lyft. It's such a well-used service, and there's so many employees, or not employees, but drivers, or both. But what's really interesting is the other job categories that are also impacted. I was reading through some of the other exemptions they had to kind of put in or figure out over the course of the year. So entrepreneurs, they had to figure out a way to deal with that. Freelance writers, I mentioned already, appraisers, musicians in some circumstances. They're trying to figure out how do they deal with community theater folks. Truck drivers in many cases are independent contractors, and how does that work? Newspaper carriers and newspaper delivery, maids. So there's a whole bunch of job categories that, on the one hand, to your point, Bill, you say, well, these people should all have healthcare. They should all have, decent minimum wage. So yes, we want all that. But at the same time, the entire business model gets blown up in a way. If you suddenly force them to be employees, right? So it's an interesting thing. And, my thinking on this, Matt, I kind of want to come back to you because you asked Bill and I if you thought this was going to spread or people were thinking about it nationally. What are your thoughts? Do you think it's going to become more of is this something that, are people looking at this, or do you think people look at this and going, man, this is working so well in California, we want to emulate it? Or do you think people look at this going, this is just a giant can of worms, maybe we shouldn't? Is it a failed experiment? Is it a successful experiment? Do you think it's going to catch on? What do you think?
I don't think it's a failed experiment. I think that sort of, reading some of the tea leaves, this definitely has the possibility to spread. I had actually pulled a quote from Anthony Fox, who's the chief policy officer at Lyft and also former U.S. Secretary of Transportation. And he had said, I think Prop 22 has now created a structure for us to discuss with leaders in other states and Washington potentially. We think that Prop 22 has now created a model that can be replicated and can be scaled. So, I think it's possible that we're going to see this in other places. Some of the things you were just talking about with all these different types of roles, I think the problem is that you can't fit, even if you look at the gig economy or, gig jobs like this and workers and that sort of stuff, you can't put it all in one box. I think that's what we're learning here is that each one of these roles is it's completely different as these new types of positions like, Uber and Lyft drivers and that sort of stuff, get created and, our industries change and stuff like that. Government is going to try and put them all into one box, but then what you saw here is, businesses, private businesses are going to be able to raise money to sort of overcome that stuff with fundraising, those sort of things. Like one of the other things I saw was, I forget who this quote was. I think it was from an employment lawyer, but I'm just full of quotes today.
It's full of something.
Good point. There's another podcast for you.
What is Matt full of today?
The public is now versed in the concept of AB5. So I guess my question is it really going to take $200 million when talking about, the money that was raised by all these organizations to pass Prop 22? Is it really going to take $200 million for the next industry? It was passed by an overwhelming majority, so it may not take $200 million next time. So it won't be as costly to these businesses to, get things set up in the way that they want to have them.
Yep, exactly.
it's true. I mean, there's so many things that come out of this, and I think states are going to, like, our listeners should be just monitoring what their states are doing in response to this. It'll be slow, but they're like, every state's going to start looking at this, issue, and how do we define employees, because the world is changing. Meanwhile, I think it's somewhat, there's some irony here in that this is all about employees for a slate of companies that doesn't make any money. They're all none of them are profitable, I believe. And I've heard, I'm not an expert on the what do they call them, the delivery network companies, or the driving companies, but I think a lot of their business model is built on driverless cars. So this is an interim thing for them, and that the drivers are just like a necessary resource to get them from inception with, big consumer adoption to an efficient model where they have, Uber buys, millions of driverless cars, and now it's a complete technology company with, a very small number of people, and so, I mean, that in and of itself is interesting, because these, employees or contractors, whichever side of it, you're on, whichever state you're in, are, potentially not going to matter anymore in the equation, because they're not going to be employed when and if driverless cars become a thing. So I think that's, that is interesting. And I just want to say, I love the fact that the story, everyone who writes an article refers to driving forces. Just want to call attention to that little pun.
Nice. So we got to get our prediction in here before we run out of time, though, Bill. And so my question for you is, and you kind of got to this, because if having if drivers in vehicles and all is just sort of an interim step, and this problem is going to kind of solve itself if the primary driver for AB5 was really Uber and Lyft, and they're going to sort of eventually move away from drivers altogether. My question for you is this the beginning of the end of AB5 or the end of the beginning? Bill.
I think it's the end of the beginning, given the two choices. But I think what's going to happen is I think Prop 22 is actually like amending AB5. And I think what's going to happen is it's going to, ping pong its way through changes to make it make more sense overall. But I don't really know. And I do think it's the concessions from there's sort of no AB5, Prop 22, and then AB5 is your continuum. Mm-hmm. So because Prop 22 is not getting rid of AB5 for these companies, it's just weakening it a lot or modifying it a lot. And I think that's actually going to help the drivers potentially. I mean, if you listen to Uber and Lyft and DoorDash and those guys, it's probably going to help the drivers a lot. If you listen to the anti-Prop 22, it's not going to help them much, but it is, raising the amount of money they make, giving them some insurance, both on their health and on their cars. And I think that's, collectively going to help the drivers, because one of the things that I haven't seen any studies on, but this is basically like a cab system where, all of the burden is on the driver. It's your personal car, unless you rent one from Uber or Lyft. But it's like you bring the car, you bring the insurance. You have to clean the car. You sort of are doing all the work. You buy the gas. So I think I think anything that gives more money to the drivers will help them survive better, even if it's not clear to me whether it's that the full AB5 would be significantly more, a little more, no more, or less money in the driver's pocket at the end of the day, because of the lack of being able to play Uber and Lyft against each other and sort of the other things you could do in the old rules. It's a whole lot of nothing in my prediction.
All right, Matt, which beginning of the end or end of the beginning, Matt?
Can I just say I don't know, and I agree with Bill? Is that a fair answer?
Yes, because Bill basically said I don't know for like 5 minutes. So
I'm not the.
That's my job.
I know I'm not the type to pontificate and the wordsmith like you to be able to give such a good answer that ends up with saying I don't know. So I kind of feel like you nailed it there, Bill.
Why, thank you. You're going to get a big Christmas bonus
I'm
this year.
Say,
hey, you said I was full of something earlier. So
he did. That's true. I heard that.
I reiterated it.
I'm actually going to say, I'm going to be stronger. I'm going to say it's the beginning of the end. I think the fundamentals of AB5 were so open to unintended consequences. I thought the quote you pulled, Matt, was really interesting, that the future is Prop 22. So I think what they're going to try to do is really, can we avoid that thing that was AB5, and can we package Prop 22, which is really, if you've got a certain number of these kinds of workers, you do need to provide some kind of minimum income guarantee and minimum health benefit guarantee, but you don't need to make them all official employees and try to lighten it up a little bit. I think that's probably the future. I think where AB5 was too strong and has affected too many industries. And I think I hope other states will learn from that and probably be more focused on, hey, for these specific industries where we think there might be abuse, let's fix those, as opposed to these broad strokes of just everybody needs to be an employee, because that oversimplifies, I think. And I think we've learned, hopefully, I think everybody's learned a little bit from that. So there we have it. Thank you, Matt and Bill. Hope you guys, hope our listeners all found some value in today's talk. What do you think? What do you think about AB5 and Prop 22? Let us know. Send us email to coffee@payfactors.com or reach out to us on Twitter @payfactors. And thanks for listening, and enjoy the rest of your day. Comp and Coffee is a PayFactors production dedicated to the compensation community. We welcome your feedback. Send email to coffee@payfactors.com, tweet us @payfactors, or share your thoughts in our PayFactors community tile. Until next time, keep your coffee hot and your data fresh.